Welcome to today's deep dive. If you are a high school history student or just someone who loves digging into the past, you are stepping into a massive living history laboratory today.
We really are. It's a completely different way to look at a period we think we know everything about.
Right. Because normally when you study World War II, you're looking at like these very neat maps.
Yeah, the strategic math.
Exactly. You see these clean lines showing troop advancements across Europe or the Pacific Theater, and it all feels very tactical, very structured.
It gives this comforting illusion of control. I mean, a way to categorize a period of just massive, almost incomprehensible global chaos.
But our mission for this deep dive is to look away from the battlefields.
Right.
We are going to look at the physical reality behind the arsenal of democracy. And let me tell you, that clean map completely dissolves when you look at the home front.
Oh, absolutely. It's chaotic.
Imagine you're not looking at a strategic troop movement. You're looking at an empty farm field in Michigan or a really muddy floodplain in Oregon.
Just completely empty spaces.
Yeah. And then, almost magically, overnight, those empty spaces transform into bustling, fully populated cities.
Instant metropolises.
Right, complete with grocery stores, schools, post offices, movie theaters. And they were built exclusively to house the millions of wartime migrants who are actually building that arsenal of democracy.
Because, when we talk about outproducing the Axis powers, we are ultimately talking about human labor.
Yeah.
The steel didn't forge itself. The aluminum didn't rivet itself. Hundreds of thousands of human beings needed a place to sleep, to eat, and to just exist between these totally exhausting shifts.
So our narrative roadmap today is going to take us through three distinct phases of this history.
Right, the life cycle of these boomtowns.
Exactly. First, we'll look at the construction, the explosive rise of these instant cities.
Which is just a mind-boggling logistical feat.
It really is. Then we'll dive into the crisis, the intense and honestly pretty grim daily reality of living in these spaces.
Because they were deeply flawed places to live.
Heavily flawed, heavily segregated, and explicitly treated as disposable, which leads us to part three, the final outcomes.
Right. What happens to a disposable city when the war ends?
And spoiler alert, it leads to one of the most tragic and sudden erasures of a community in U.S. history.
It really does.
So to ground this for you, the listener, especially if you're a student trying to picture this, I want you to use this analogy. Imagine your high school, right?
Sure.
Imagine it suddenly multiplies its student body by 10
Oh, wow.
in a single week.
Just an absolute tidal wave of people.
Right. Where do you put the desks? Where does the plumbing go? How do you keep the cafeteria from completely falling apart?
You can't. I mean, the systems just break.
Exactly. And that is exactly what happened to the American home front in 1942. It was a total system failure of existing infrastructure.
Because the sheer economic motivation of the wartime employers was just unprecedented.
Talk about that. What do you mean by economic motivation?
Well, the federal government is basically handing out blank checks to these industrial giants.
Like Henry Kaiser?
Right. Henry Kaiser, tasked with building Liberty ships on the West Coast. Or Henry Ford, transitioning his entire massive automobile infrastructure to pump out B-24 bombers in Michigan.
The mandate is just
Right.
produce as much as you can, as fast as you can.
Exactly. Cost is completely irrelevant. Time is everything. Every single day a ship isn't in the water, the war effort bleeds.
So these employers just start hiring like crazy.
Yeah, they are hiring at a velocity that local economies had literally never seen before. We're talking about bringing in tens of thousands of workers in a matter of weeks.
From all over the country, right?
Oh, everywhere. People migrating from the deep south, people fleeing the remnants of the Dust Bowl.
It's just crossing the country for that promise of steady, high-paying industrial work.
But the bottleneck of this whole production miracle wasn't the factories. It was the local towns.
Because they couldn't absorb them.
Not even close.
Mm-hmm.
Local real estate markets just do not have the agility to build 50,000 houses in a month.
Right. You can't just call up your local lumberyard and say, hey, I need to build a new city by Tuesday.
Right. Using standard municipal zoning laws and local contractors. Forget about it. The industrial ambition completely outstrips civic capacity.
So what does that actually look like on the ground in these towns?
It's chaos. The sources talk about how the invisible systems we take for granted just buckled. Water pressure dropping to a trickle because 10 times the normal number of taps are open.
Oh, man.
Sewers literally backing up into the streets because the pipes were sized for a sleepy town of a few thousand, not an industrial juggernaut of 50,000.
That is incredibly gross, but also just mechanically it makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And schools. The schools trying to accommodate this sudden influx of thousands of migrant children had to run these extreme split shifts.
What does a split shift look like for a high school?
Well, a building designed for 500 kids would cycle through 3 different groups of students in a single day.
Wow.
Yeah, some attending for just 2 or 3 hours early in the morning, others late in the afternoon.
So the whole foundational element of a functioning society is just cracking.
Under the sheer weight of numbers.
But out of all those failing systems, the absolute most desperate bottleneck was basic shelter.
The housing crisis. It was incredibly severe.
Right, and this leads to a phenomenon in our sources that just blew my mind. It's called hotbedding.
Yes, hotbedding. It really illustrates the desperation of these migrant families.
Explain how hotbedding actually worked, mechanically speaking.
Okay, so the factories are operating around the clock. Morning, swing, and graveyard shifts.
Because the horn never stops.
Right. But there literally aren't enough physical beds within a 30-mile radius of these plants. So workers would rent the exact same bed in rotations.
That is just wild to me.
3 different shift workers.
Yeah.
Often complete strangers, leasing a single mattress in a boarding house.
So the moment the morning worker wakes up to go to the shipyard,
The graveyard shift worker, who is totally exhausted and covered in industrial grime, walks through the door and climbs into that exact same bed.
the mattress literally never had time to cool down.
Hence the term hotbedding.
I mean, I want you to really think about the mechanics of that. It's like sharing a gym locker with 3 strangers, except it's the place you're supposed to rest your head.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. It's incredibly invasive.
How does a worker even maintain their sanity in that environment, let alone their physical health? You're working a 10-hour shift welding steel, and your only sanctuary is a warm mattress that smells like a stranger's sweat.
Honestly. A lot of them did maintain their health. The physical toll was immense.
I can imagine.
Exhaustion became chronic. And communicable diseases spread like wildfire in those cramped conditions.
Because everyone is just cycling through the same tiny, unventilated spaces.
Exactly. And the federal government and these massive contractors, they realized very quickly that this was unsustainable.
The jet engine was going to stall.
Right. You cannot sustain a global war effort if your workforce is dropping from dysentery or just pure psychological burnout because they don't have shelter.
So the free market had completely failed. They couldn't build houses fast enough.
So the government steps in with a radical solution.
And this is where we move into the actual instant cities. They decide to conjure whole towns from scratch.
When you need a city for 40,000 people, and there isn't one, you just build it.
The scale of this intervention is staggering. I mean, let's look at Henry Kaiser in Oregon.
Oh, Vanport, the ultimate example.
Right. He needs tens of thousands of workers for his Liberty ships. So his operation just throws up this city called Vanport.
Right on a floodplain between Portland and the Columbia River.
At its peak, how big was Vanport?
It held roughly 40,000 people.
40,000. It instantly became the second largest city in the entire state of Oregon. Just poof, out of the mud.
It was actually the largest U.S. public housing project in the country at the time.
And it wasn't just Vanport.
No, the map of the U.S. was dotted with these places.
Like Bomber City.
Right, over in Michigan. Henry Ford's B-24 bomber plant generated this housing development at Willow Run that was so rapid and chaotic, the locals just called it Bomber City.
And there were others, right?
Yeah. Kaiser's shipyards swelled Richmond, California, several times over its pre-war size. We see rapid expansions in Mobile, Alabama, Baltimore, Wichita.
And Marin City, right?
Yes, the federal town of Marin City, built right beside the Marinship yard in Sausalito.
Now, I have to stop you there and push back a little bit.
Sure.
You're telling me that the federal government, while fighting a 2-front global war, dealing with massive material shortages,
Yeah.
they somehow found the time and resources to build grocery stores and movie theaters in these temporary towns?
Yeah.
Why not just build rows of military tents?
It's a really logical question. Why divert resources like that?
Right. It seems like a huge waste of materials. Just build bare-bones barracks and be done with it.
Well, the answer comes down to worker retention.
Oh, because they were quitting.
Exactly. The early attempts at simply throwing up basic barracks were a disaster.
Yeah.
Workers would arrive, see these appalling prison-like conditions, work for 2 weeks, and just leave.
And you can't run a bomber plant if your workforce turns over every month.
You really can't. The jobs required highly specialized training. To keep families there, to keep them stable and productive, the contractors realized they had to provide a facsimile of normal civic life.
So the movie theaters were essentially a production tool.
Yes. They diverted resources to build schools and clinics because morale was directly tied to output.
Okay, that makes sense from a utilitarian standpoint. It's an incredible achievement. They proved the wartime state could house its workforce when motivated.
They absolutely proved that.
But let's pivot to part 2 here, the crisis. Because we need to talk about the quality of what was actually being built.
Right. The transition from this awe-inspiring logistical triumph to the very gritty reality of living inside it.
Because if you are erecting a city for 40,000 people on a muddy floodplain in a few months, you are not using high-grade steel and deep concrete foundations.
You are cutting every conceivable corner.
So what was the physical reality of a hastily built instant city? What did it feel like to live in one of these prefab units?
Well, imagine walls so thin you can hear a normal conversation 2 units over.
Oh, that sounds awful.
It was. Standard building materials, heavy timber, quality steel, copper wiring, all of that was heavily rationed for the military.
So what did they use?
The builders had to rely on substitute materials. The foundations were rarely deep, poured concrete. They were often just wooden blocks set directly onto the graded dirt.
Wait, really? Just wooden blocks on dirt?
Yes, literally resting on the mud.
So they're basically building homes out of the scraps of the war effort.
Exactly. Insulation was minimal, so these units were freezing in the winter and sweltering in the summer.
And how did they heat them?
Usually just a small, really inefficient coal or wood stove in the center of the unit.
Which sounds like a massive fire risk.
It absolutely was.
Yeah.
And they required constant attention.
It's just such a stark contrast to the propaganda.
How so?
Well, the posters for the Arsenal of Democracy feature these gleaming steel machines, shining muscles, and patriotic sacrifice.
Right, the very heroic aesthetic.
Yeah. But the daily reality is you work a 10-hour shift in a deafening shipyard, and you come home to a tiny, drafty, paper-thin box.
Where you can hear your neighbor coughing.
You hear couples arguing, you hear every single footstep. And let's talk about the environment outside the box.
Now mud.
The mud. Because they built these places so fast, things like paved sidewalks were just luxury afterthoughts.
The mud was a universal complaint in the historical records. In Vanport or Willow Run, workers constantly described trudging to work through knee-deep, freezing muck.
Because the infrastructure couldn't handle the drainage.
Exactly.
You know, it's funny, it makes you look differently at the modern architecture we see today.
What do you mean?
Like, you look around any major city now, and you see these massive, identical apartment blocks popping up in a matter of months.
Oh.
We're still building fast, relatively cheap structures for a transient workforce. The aesthetic changed, but that economic drive for speed over permanence has deep roots here.
It really does. And that connection to permanence brings us to one of the most defining policies of these boomtowns: disposability.
Yes. The explicit federal decision to treat these towns as disposable.
The federal government designated these cities as strictly for the duration.
For the duration.
That phrase was stamped on everything.
It was legally and operationally binding. They were never intended to be permanent additions to the American landscape.
The plan from day one was to tear them down.
To clear them out, bulldoze them, or dismantle them the very moment peace was declared.
I really want you, the listener, to pause and think about the psychology of that for a second.
It's heavy.
What does it do to a migrant family when they are forced to build their entire life, raise their kids, and form a community in a town that the country has already decided to throw away?
A home is supposed to be an anchor.
Exactly. How do you invest emotionally in a community that has a built-in expiration date?
You don't. Or at least it's incredibly difficult. It creates this pervasive, low-level trauma.
A profound sense of instability. And it actively discourages civic engagement. Why would you plant a garden or fight for better school resources when the whole town is scheduled for demolition?
And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, doesn't it?
In what way?
Well, because the government declared them temporary, they use that as an excuse for the shoddy construction.
Oh, absolutely. Why pour deep foundations if the town is coming down in 3 years?
Right. But because the construction was terrible, the living conditions rapidly deteriorated.
Which the municipalities then pointed to as proof that these towns were blights that needed to be destroyed.
It's a vicious cycle, but we need to make it very clear from the sources that this neglect was not distributed equally.
No, it was not.
We have to examine how these towns were managed regarding race, because this is where the federal policies become actively destructive.
This is a huge point. We are often taught about the Great Migration and the promise of equal opportunity in wartime industries.
Right. Executive Order 8802, which famously banned discrimination in the defense industry.
But when you look at the physical reality of housing, the federal authorities didn't just fail to enforce that order, they actively engineered strict racial segregation.
It was literally baked into the blueprints.
Let's look at the mechanics of that. The federal housing authorities worked hand in hand with local prejudices. They maintained strict quotas.
And separate waiting lists based entirely on race.
Yes. In Vanport, out of the 40,000 residents, roughly 6,000 were black.
And the overarching pattern nationwide was that Black workers were consistently assigned to the worst, most crowded sections of these cities.
They were deliberately placed in the marshiest areas of the floodplains, or in the units closest to the deafening noise and toxic exhaust of the industrial plants.
Even though they were doing the exact same essential war work.
Exactly. And the construction quality in these segregated sections was often noticeably inferior to the already poor baseline of the white sections.
Let's drill down into the pressure cooker this created. You take a workforce that is already exhausted. You place them in hastily built, paper-thin units surrounded by mud.
Right.
Then you impose a rigid, systemic racial hierarchy that traps Black workers in the most degraded conditions, regardless of their income.
That's a crucial point. Even if a black family had saved their wages and a unit was sitting empty in a better section of the project, federal authorities would deny them access to it.
You are engineering a social explosion. You cannot force human beings into cramped, disposable, deeply unequal conditions and expect them to quietly endure it.
The extreme overcrowding combined with strict segregation created an unbearable friction.
Which is the exact recipe for the racial violence that tore through the country in 1943.
The sources explicitly connect the physical conditions of these boomtowns to the riots in Detroit, the clashes in Mobile, and the soaring tensions across the nation.
The government desperately needed the labor of Black workers to win the war, but entirely refused to grant them the dignity of equal space.
But despite all of this, the hotbedding, the mud, the thin walls, the systemic racism, these migrant families actually did it.
They endured the crisis. They built the ships. They assembled the bombers. They produced the arsenal of democracy.
And they won the war.
But that victory brings us to part 3 of our deep dive, the final outcomes.
Right. What happens when the whistles blow?
The ticker tape falls in Times Square, the war is over, and the temporary clock finally runs out.
By late 1945, the economic engine that willed these cities into existence throws itself violently into reverse.
The federal government cancels the massive contracts overnight.
The shipyards go quiet. The bomber plants lay off tens of thousands of workers in a single week.
The entire reason for these cities to exist just evaporates.
And this initiates the post-war emptying.
A lot of workers packed up their cars to try and find the next opportunity or tried to return to their home states.
And the government immediately lines up the bulldozers to fulfill its promise. The duration is over. Time to dismantle the projects.
But the core tragedy here is the disconnect between the economic policy and human reality.
How do you mean?
Henry Kaiser didn't need 40,000 people living on a floodplain anymore, but those people still needed a place to exist.
You can cancel a shipbuilding contract. You cannot cancel a population.
Exactly. Returning home wasn't an option for everyone. For many, it meant going back to the brutal reality of sharecropping in the Jim Crow South.
Or returning to a farm in the Midwest that the Dust Bowl had completely consumed.
They had spent years building actual breathing communities in these boomtowns, despite the government calling them disposable.
Which brings us to the most visceral and heartbreaking sequence in our sources today, the fate of Vanport.
We need to trace how this massive logistical triumph physically transformed into a disaster zone.
The timeline is critical here.
Let's walk through it.
So the war ends in 1945. But if we jump forward to 1948, Vanport is still standing.
It hasn't been completely bulldozed yet.
No. The population dropped, but it still houses about 18,500 people.
18,500 people is not a ghost town. That is a massive, vibrant community.
Absolutely.
But to understand why they were still living in degrading, temporary, rotting prefab units 3 years after the war ended, we have to look at the mechanics of housing discrimination.
Because the obvious question is, why didn't they just move into the permanent city of Portland?
And the answer is redlining.
The mechanism of redlining legally trapped them.
Right. A huge portion of the remaining residents in Vanport were Black families, and the broader metropolitan area of Portland, like many cities, was restricted by real estate covenants.
Let's explain how a covenant actually works mechanically.
Yeah, it's not just a polite suggestion from a neighborhood watch.
No, it is a legally binding clause written directly into the property deed of a house.
These covenants explicitly stated that the property could never be sold or even rented to anyone who wasn't white.
If a homeowner tried to sell to a black family, they could literally be sued by their neighbors.
And the sale would be invalidated by a court.
Furthermore, the banks cooperated with this system.
They drew literal red lines on maps around neighborhoods where black people lived.
And refused to issue mortgages in those areas, or to black applicants looking elsewhere.
So even if a black shipyard worker had dutifully saved their wartime wages for years and wanted to buy a permanent home on higher ground in Portland,
The entire legal and financial system functioned as a wall denying them that opportunity.
they were geographically trapped in a rotting temporary city built on a floodplain.
Which sets the stage for a very specific, devastating date, May 30th, 1948.
Memorial Day weekend, a Sunday afternoon.
The Columbia River has been running dangerously high due to a heavy spring runoff.
And the residents of Vanport are understandably nervous. They know they live on a floodplain.
They are relying entirely on a system of dikes to keep the river out of their living rooms.
We want to walk you through the minute by minute of this afternoon because it highlights the ultimate failure of this entire expendable system.
The local housing authority, the officials managing the project, are aware of the rising water.
But instead of organizing an evacuation, what do?
They actively distribute flyers to the residents that morning.
The flyers explicitly assured the residents that the dikes were safe.
The exact wording on the flyer was, "Don't get excited."
Don't get excited! Unbelievable!
They told people to stay put, to trust the infrastructure.
So reassured by the authorities, people just go about their Sunday. Kids are outside playing in the alleys between these prefab units.
Families are listening to the radio, just a normal day off.
And then at 4:17 p.m., the unthinkable happens.
The catastrophic failure wasn't even the main concrete river dike.
What was it?
It was a railroad embankment that had been casually integrated into the containment system.
It wasn't engineered to hold back a swollen river.
Not at all. The embankment simply gave way. It crumbled under the immense hydrostatic pressure.
And when a barrier like that fails, it's not a slow leak.
No, the Columbia River poured through the breach like a wall of water.
Within minutes, a 10-foot-high wall of water was tearing violently through the streets of Vanport.
Remember the construction mechanics we discussed earlier?
The lack of deep foundations. The substitute materials.
The wooden blocks resting on mud.
When the water hit those hastily built apartment buildings, they didn't just flood.
They literally tore loose from their shallow moorings.
They became buoyant.
Entire apartment blocks, full of people, simply lifted off the ground.
They floated into the churning water and started violently smashing into each other like toys in a bathtub.
The aftermath defies belief. In a matter of hours, the entire city of Vanport was submerged.
Oregon's second largest community was completely erased from the map in a single afternoon.
The residents had mere minutes to react. The warning sirens didn't even go off immediately.
It was pure, unadulterated chaos. People fled with whatever they could physically carry in their arms.
Tragically, some people died in the floodwaters. And instantly, 18,500 people were displaced.
And I want you to consider the compounding tragedy for the thousands of black families who lost everything in those waters.
They were already trapped by redlining.
Right. And now they were scattered into a surrounding region whose legal covenants still severely restricted their options.
They lost their homes, their possessions, their entire community network.
And they were forced to seek emergency shelter in a broader city that had legally codified that it did not want them there.
It is so grim.
It's like a massive, cruel magic trick. The federal government conjures a sprawling city out of thin air to win a war. They extract the labor they need.
And then, the moment that purpose is served, they simply pull the curtain away and allow the entire thing to be washed away by the river.
The illusion of safety and community was entirely shattered.
The Vanport flood really crystallizes the core theme of this era. Yes, the immediate cause was a natural disaster. The river flooded.
But it was a natural disaster fatally sharpened by a long chain of deliberate human choices.
The choice to build a city for 40,000 people on a known floodplain.
The choice to cut corners and build flimsy structures without foundations.
The legal choice to trap black residents there through redlining.
And the bureaucratic choice to confidently assure them they were safe when the infrastructure was failing.
Vanport stands as the bleakest, most literal verdict of how disposable these towns and the people living in them were considered.
They were built to be thrown away, and in the end, they were washed away.
It is a devastatingly dark chapter.
It is. But history rarely moves in a perfectly straight line, and the story of the World War II boomtowns is not a complete monolith.
Right. Not every single instant city met the fate of Vanport.
And that contrast is vital to understanding the full legacy of this era. I want to shift our focus down the coast to California.
To Marin City.
Yes, located right beside the old Marin shipyard in Sausalito.
Structurally and politically, Marin City was cut from the exact same cloth as Vanport.
It was a federally funded, hastily constructed boomtown.
It utilized prefab materials. It was rigidly segregated during the war.
And it was absolutely meant to be temporary. For the duration.
But Marin City did not wash away.
No, it wasn't destroyed by a catastrophic flood, and despite the original intentions, it wasn't completely bulldozed by the government when the war ended.
Marin City managed to survive the post-war period.
How did it pull that off?
Well, the community dynamics reshaped themselves. As the shipyards closed, the demographics shifted.
Right.
The wartime workers who stayed transitioned into different regional industries.
So through sheer stubbornness and community willpower, those temporary, flimsy structures slowly and painfully evolved into a permanent fixture of the landscape.
There is a really fascinating detail in our sources that brings this abstract history incredibly close to home.
Oh, the personal connection.
Yeah, the compiler of these historical documents actually has a direct family tie to this specific town's survival.
Their father served the community of Marin City as a physician in the 1950s.
It's a profound reminder of the human element.
It really is. The government viewed these places as spreadsheets and logistical problems.
But for the people living there, raising families, practicing medicine, it was a real breathing community.
Why does Marin City's survival matter so much in the context of this deep dive?
Because it proves that while the policy designated these spaces as disposable, the human beings living inside them refused to be disposed of.
Because places like Marin City dug their heels in and endured, we actually have a physical space to return to.
We don't just have to rely on black and white photos of Vanport sinking into the mud.
Right. We can study the legacy of the arsenal of democracy in the geography of a surviving community today.
Marin City serves as a living bridge from the frantic, muddy chaos of the 1940s wartime migration directly to our modern era.
It forces us to reckon with the fact that you can't just build a city, fill it with human lives, and then expect to cleanly erase it.
You really can't.
As we step back and synthesize everything we've covered today, the scope of this history is just dizzying.
It is. We looked at the awe-inspiring industrial torque that conjured massive instant cities out of empty fields to solve an impossible housing bottleneck.
We broke down the grueling mechanics of that solution, the claustrophobia of hotbedding,
The crumbling public infrastructure.
and the oppressive engineered reality of federal segregation.
We examined the deeply damaging psychological toll of forcing a population to live for the duration.
Labeling their homes and their communities as inherently disposable.
And we witnessed the wildly divergent outcomes.
The tragic, entirely preventable erasure of Vanport in a single afternoon.
Contrasted against the stubborn, enduring survival of Marin City.
It's a history that forces us to question the built environment around us today.
Absolutely. Every building, every zoning law, every fast-track construction project is a reflection of societal priorities.
We spent this deep dive examining how the hastily built, utilitarian architecture of the World War II boomtowns perfectly mirrored the government's view of those workers.
They desperately needed their labor, but they did not value their long-term humanity or permanence.
Which brings us to a final thought I want you to carry with you as you go about your week.
This is an important one.
Look closely at the skyline of your own city today. Look at the newest, most rapidly built structures popping up in your community.
The ones that seem to go up overnight.
Exactly. Whether you are looking at gleaming, hastily erected 5/1 luxury condos, massive dormitories built to house transient tech and gig workers, or the temporary, bare-bones shelters constructed for unhoused populations.
What do the physical mechanics of those buildings say about our current values?
Who is society building permanent, generational infrastructure for?
And more importantly, who does our modern economy currently consider expendable for the duration?
It's a continuous thread. The choices made in the mudflats of 1942 are echoed in the concrete we pour today.
Because the structures we choose to build and the structures we allow to fail tell the absolute truth about who we care about.
Even when our words say otherwise, keep looking closely at the buildings around you, keep questioning the systems as they are presented to you, and we will see you next time.